Princess Rachel and the young Fabian girl Justine were sitting atop the bed cover in Rachel's chamber in the caverns of Rekos. Rachel had just returned from her meeting with Dovain, where she had agreed to his proposal. Rachel would become the Dark Lord's bride, and in return, he would rebuild and protect her kingdom. The two had not had time, though, to discuss any of the details of their marriage, since Dovain had been interrupted by one of his servants. Rachel was glad for the interruption. She needed time to gather her thoughts. And, from the servant, she had learned of the presence of two intruders in Rekos. She prayed with all of her heart that these two men were Atticus and Marcus. She wanted them to know that she was safe. It was strange to think, she reflected, that only a day ago she had been captured and taken here as an offering to the Dark Lord. And now she had accepted his proposal of marriage and was planning to make Dovain her king. Rachel believed Dovain's story, and that his hatred of the goddess was justified. He had lost his family, his gypsy tribe, and many of his loyal followers because of the guardian Altama. She believed that the hero had been wrong to attack the Dark Lord, and had been ruthless to his people in blind prejudice. This is partially why Rachel wanted to trust Dovain, because the two of them were so alike. Rachel's parents had both, at different times, been taken from her during the overthrow of Canadak. Her kingdom had burned to the ground, and Rachel had lost everything. All she had now were the last of her people, which she would do anything to protect. Dovain was the only one capable of saving them, so she knew that she must trust him. She had to accept his offer before the last of the Canadak villagers were hunted down and destroyed by Salvador's men. Why they had continued their destruction after Justine had been found, she did not understand. There was no reason to kill the villagers, but she had learned that Salvador's plans seldom made sense, and he acted solely on his emotions. Rachel knew that only Dovain had the power to stop Salvador, so for that reason, she was willing to trust him, willing to accept his hand in marriage in return for his alliance with her. The two reached this conclusion as they sat atop the bed, talking in hushed voices to one another, but all the while they talked, Rachel kept wondering about the two intruders in Rekos. She wanted desperately to know if Atticus and Marcus were the ones they had found their way into the caverns, but she was fearful to leave the safety of her chamber. However, she had to know if her two friends had at last found her. So, convincing Justine that she would return safely, Rachel left her chamber. The caverns were a twisting maze of passages, and she was nervous as she heard her own footsteps resounding off of the stone walls. The hem of her trailing blue gown fluttered, and her hair, dark as the trunks of the forest pine, came loose from her braid. The wavy brown strands, gusting like seagrass caught by the wind, streamed behind her as she raced through the passages in search of her two brave companions. And as she rounded the corner of the dim cavern, she spotted the intruders, and was overjoyed as she recognized their familiar faces. But as she drew nearer, she could sense a great melancholy. Atticus was crouched beside his dear friend, who rested motionless against the stone wall. As Rachel approached, Atticus lifted his eyes to look at her. At first there was a twinge of fear in them, but he recognized her after a moment, and his expression became one of relief. He beckoned her closer and explained what happened, that Dovain had taken Marcus's battle axe, and in doing so, had struck his shoulder with a poisoned blade. Marcus had attempted to clear the wound of poison with bloodletting, but had fallen unconscious. Atticus had closed off the wound and began trying to wake his friend, but Marcus was unresponsive. Marcus showed no signs of recovery as he lay still against the rock, deathly pale. But the two stayed by their friend's side and waited, praying silently that Marcus would find the strength to awaken. And while these things were taking place, the Dark Lord and his most favored servant Salvador spoke in hushed voices together in the chamber beyond the dining hall. Before meeting Salvador, Dovain had never confided in any of his servants before, but somehow Salvador was different. Dovain spoke proudly of how he had struck down the descendant of the Guardian and taken the weapon, chuckling deeply as he noted how weak young Marcus was compared to his ancestor. Salvador listened well to the story his master told, and was proud to serve such a powerful king. The two began a walk through the western caverns, a place darker than any other Salvador had ever seen. Dovain walked ahead of Salvador, carrying the battle-axe triumphantly in his hands as they descended through the darkness, his broad and towering form crouching to pass through the tunnel, where Salvador strode easily through. Dovain listened to Salvador's footsteps as the two followed the twisting stone corridors, and he laughed slightly to himself as he heard his young servant fumbling in the darkness behind him. These caverns were clear in Dovain's mind. Every pebble, every crevice, every twist and dip in the stone. He had memorized this place over what felt like an eternity. His eyes were adjusted to the blackness, and his ears sharp for any sound in the distance. Salvador, however, stayed near to the dim silhouette ahead of him, knowing he could easily become lost. But Dovain would not leave Salvador to wander in the darkness, though it may be amusing. No, he would never admit it, but he was quite fond of Salvador. Glancing back over his shoulder, Dovain could see the boy scrambling to keep up with him, his long hair whipping about as he shuffled along the steep rocks. Part of Salvador's hair was the very same glistening silver as the blade of the battle-axe in his hands. When Dovain had rescued Salvador from the forest last winter, he had marveled the pure silver hair adorning the head of the young prince. He knew that this must be a sign of blessing upon the boy by the goddess, so it was Dovain's great pleasure to mar the adornment with his own mark of favor. There on Salvador's cheek, beneath where the silver hair streamed across his face, was the scarred burn of the seal of darkness, her blessing only accentuating the sense of victory he felt as Dovain took Salvador in as his chosen servant. No other exile was permitted to dwell in the fortress of Rekos, nor could they address their king without bowing and groveling. But Salvador was unlike Dovain's other servants. With the utmost devotion and admiration, Salvador learned from his master and obeyed his commands, honored to feel needed. He would often join Dovain on his hunting trips, and stood beside his master as he commanded his followers. Dovain took pride in Salvador's devotion, and was ready to test his loyalty with a task of grave importance. After passing silently through the caverns, the two reached the foot of a massive stone staircase, and at the top of it shined a glow of sunlight. As they stood at the foot of the staircase, Dovain turned about to face his loyal servant, as he held the silver battle-axe out in his hands before him. Salvador hesitantly took the axe from his master, nervous to be trusted with such a responsibility. With a deep nod, Dovain released the weapon which had been forged to destroy him into Salvador's hands, knowing he could trust no other with it, speaking in a low and serious tone as he said, "Do as I have instructed you to do, and you shall be greatly rewarded for your loyalty to me." With a deeply honored bow of his head, the young exiled Prince of Callister answered, "It will be done, master." And Salvador raced up the staircase, clutching the weapon tightly in his grasp. Dovain watched as Salvador vanished up the spiraling staircase, the glint of the silver blade fading slowly as the Dark Lord turned back into his shadowy caverns of Rekos, where his lovely bride-to-be would be waiting his return. And Dovain smiled to himself as he thought of her, and chuckled deeply as he wove quickly through the passages of the caverns, eager to return and claim what had been promised to him.